Greetings, friends and educators. Welcome back to The Informed Educator. We're Lauren and Anne, and today we're so happy to be welcoming Dr. Stephanie Muehlethaler. Stephanie is a college principal at Autonomy College at Trent University and is a passionate advocate for creating safe, caring, and inclusive communities where individuals can thrive as their whole authentic selves. With a rich academic background spanning 3 institutions, Steph earned her BA in Psychology and English from Wilfrid Laurier University, an MA in Higher Education and Student Affairs from the University of Connecticut, and a Doctor of Education in Higher Education Leadership from the University of Calgary. She brings her expertise and enthusiasm to her work in teaching by developing programs and curricula that foster connection and critical engagement. In this episode, we will discuss Dr. Muehlethaler's experiences in higher education, how she supports students in achieving their full potential, and specifically her innovative graduate course entitled Educational Leadership During the Time of Crisis.
So welcome, Steph. It is so nice to see you and chat with you. There was a little bio there, but I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to this place in your life, your journey in higher education.
For sure. I would say it's always interesting to hear your own bio because I know that where I am today is not at all where I thought I would be. I know the big dreams. I wanted to be an archaeologist and my mom told me to try again. So here we are. So I am an immigrant actually to Canada, and I'm originally from Switzerland, and this will all make sense in a moment. But I grew up on a dairy farm and I'm the oldest of 3. And what I knew quite early on was I was not going to take over the dairy farm. And my parents, being explorers and immigrants themselves, they literally just said, let me know where you end up. So essentially having first gen parents or being first gen myself, I could go and do whatever I wanted. And so I ended up with not too much research, but I ended up at Laurier because I love to read and I think people are fascinating. And then after that, as you can imagine, a job doesn't magically land in your lap with English and psychology, unlike my business friends. And I recruited for Laurier. Someone asked me if I would like this opportunity. And I thought, you're going to pay me to travel around Canada and talk about a place that was so instrumental in my well-being and my upbringing. I thought, this is a dream. But after a couple of years, again, doing contract work and working at the school, and I also worked on a cruise ship and a whole bunch of random things, I ended up in the office of at this point now, the Vice President of Student Affairs, but that at that point was the Dean of Students, David McMurray. And for anyone listening in higher education or in student affairs, David is the pioneer in this field. And so I just said to him, what do I do with my life? I was young and influential, and I just adored him and thought, he's doing really cool things. How can I do what he does? And I had also sidebar been a camp counselor for most of my life. And he said, you seem to be really interested in students and being involved. I was super involved in my undergrad. He said, why don't you go study student affairs? And like a lot of people in early 2000s, I was like, this is a thing. You can study student affairs. And I was like, sure, where do I go? And he said, you go to America. And I said, okay. And just to preface this is November. So if we know anything about when grad applications are due, they are very, very soon. And so I looked at America and I ended up at the University of Connecticut, where I worked in a multitude of functional areas. I worked in sexual health programming, student conduct, senior year transition and engagement programs, and first year programs. And it was amazing. Like I know that those 2 years changed my life. And after that, I applied for a job at a university back in Switzerland, and I worked in housing and residence life as the director of Res Life at Franklin University, which is a small international American pedagogy liberal arts institution that's private. That's a mouthful, but it was phenomenal. And I got bored after a couple years, not with the job, but with my brain. And so I enrolled in a doctorate of education at the University of Calgary and came back to Canada after a few years abroad. And I worked as the director of student life and the residence life and the student experience at campus living centers. And so I worked with 19 of the 24 colleges in Ontario and a few universities across the country. And lo and behold, after a few years, I ended up at Trent as a director of colleges and now principal. So in a very 2-minute snapshot, I just went where the wind took me, where things sounded different and unique. And now I've spent the last 23 years in student affairs. I know nothing else, and it has been an absolute dream.
Wow, I am so glad we asked that question.
Sorry, it's a mouthful.
What an interesting story you have. Holy smokes. You know, I wish when I was in high school and early post-secondary, I had a better understanding of the fact that for many of us, as in faculty, the path has not been straight. There have been quite a few adventures along the way and twists and turns and going where the wind blows.
Yeah, it's inspiring to hear your story, Steph, and how you had this opportunity to connect with somebody who was able to direct you in a direction that not many of us even knew about, right? I remember when I was in high school, my guidance counselor was basically like, okay, your favorite subject's biology, Trent, Western, and Guelph. There you go, right? And I often think about where I might be now if I'd known of all the different little nuances I could have pursued. So really cool to hear your story. And after all that, then I'm wondering if you could share with us some of your insights regarding the student experience. What have you learned over the years?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I had to think a lot about it. And I think, or what I have learned, is that it's really, really complex. So right now, especially in the last few years, we see a greater diversity of who our students are. I think it's not as homogeneous as it was in the early 2000s. They're no longer all 18 and straight out of high school. We're seeing way more mature and transfer students, which really, for, I'm sure, the work that you all do in the classroom, but the work that I do on a co-curricular level really changes things when students' main identity is not being a student. And so we have, I think this incoming class at Trent, 300 to 400 mature students, with the average age of our off-campus students being 23 and a half, which is several years of maturity from a 17-year-old. So I think that is really fascinating, trying to balance the multiple roles and identities that students have now, which makes the student experience way more complex in terms of how they find connection and belonging and just a home. And sometimes that's not at the institution, and that's okay. I think the world that we live in is very much different than the world I grew up in. I've come to the understanding that I no longer share a shared experience, a life experience with those students coming in. I have reached that age. I knew a world without social media. I didn't have a cell phone in university. I didn't have social media. It is completely different. And the messaging that students are getting, I ask them a lot about what it's like to be a student, I think is really different from my own experience and the information and the news that we have access to. And for me, it's about creating student supports to meet the student where they're at, instead of trying to get them where we're at. And so I think the experience is just really, really complex. I think in the last 20 years, I've learned that the students and as humans, at the end of the day, we just want to know that we're okay and that we matter and that we can find a place where we belong and we don't have to change who we are to fit in. So I think that still is true. But how we show up in these spaces, in my experience, I've learned that the overall student experience is really complex and multi-layered. And so we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, in our department, I've also certainly noticed an average or the mean age of students as being older than it was in the 2000s when I went to school 10 years ago, even before the pandemic. I'm curious, I know this bit is not supported by literature specifically, but just in your own experience, I wonder to what you owe that shift. I have a couple theories, but it is interesting to see the mean age of the students as being a little older than it used to be.
I think it's a lot of things. And again, I don't know if there's one thing, and it would be interesting, again, to grab coffee with you and see what your theories are. I think technology has something to do with it. There's way more access. There are other schools that we have one, but that have multiple online degrees. The way students can get support has changed. The access in terms of the speediness of, like, not I want to say instant gratification, but that you can get answers and support really changes the type of student that comes. I think the pressure in the world today, and it's unfortunate, but students tell me, the messaging was, okay, you have to go get your bachelor's degree. And now it's, you have to get a master's. Like, you think a bachelor's going to cut it nowadays? Like, this is what they're hearing and they're interpreting. So there are folks that feel that they need to go back to reskill themselves. I think there's a pressure on that, the idea of how are they going to reach their goals that were set out by them, sometimes by their parents, to own a house, to make X amount of dollars. I think that is changing the demographic. The amount of things we have to study is, I think, vastly different than maybe, Lauren, when you and I went to school. I mean, even at Laurier, I think one of the most exciting programs was global studies. And now you look at the diversity of programs we have and interests and types of programs, especially with different agreements with different institutions and connections with the college sector. I think it's just changing the way we can access higher education, is hopefully making it more advantageous for students that never saw themselves there. And the supports that exist for, let's say, historically marginalized students didn't exist in the same way that they did 20 years ago. And so hopefully that is why we see more mature students, more transfer students, and students that are not as homogeneous as they once were.
I'm really excited to get talking about the course you're teaching, but I do have one quick question just along those lines. There seems to be a bit of, in my conversations with some of my peers, friends and family, there seems to be a bit of a stigma about making the decision to go back to school once you'd be considered that mature student or fitting that mature student demographic, although you're still in your 20s, which I would consider to be quite young now. What advice would you give to somebody who maybe initially was following that pressure to pursue what they thought they were supposed to be doing, and now making that change and following maybe what they're interested in doing?
I mean, I can't comment on the dynamics of one's family because I know that can be really influential. And so, I mean, I'm a woohoo, feet on the ground, but head in the sky type of individual that would say, like, chase not the dreams, but your goals. And once you get there, even if you don't have the support of your family, you will of the institution. There are so many different programs and supports for students re-entering the educational realm, especially if they're worried about how to write in this day and age, or they, I know students that have come back at 60, 70, and 80 and are unfamiliar on how to use different computer programs. We have all those supports, I'll speak from Trent, to help those students be successful, and we can help you find community with other folks, because I know it may feel really isolating and lonely, but I know the numbers, and I know there are other students, and not a handful. We're talking hundreds of students that are going through this experience, and my role is to bring those folks together. So while I can't tell you what to say to your family and your loved ones of what is going on and how they can best support you, I would say lean into what your goals are and ask the questions when you get to the institutions, and let them know where you need help, because I guarantee it'll exist.
Thanks, Steph. So one of the reasons that we were especially excited to chat with you today is because of a graduate course that you teach entitled Educational Leadership During a Time of Crisis, or Educational Leadership During the Time of Crisis. And just that title, I think, instinctively and on a deep level resonates right now with quite a few people. And we're really keen to just hear a little bit more about the course, what inspired you to develop it, and what some of those key learnings are.
For sure. So I have I don't know if we're allowed to swear on this podcast. I have my subtitle is like, how do you lead when shit hits the fan? So I think I just thought, well, first of all, we don't have a lot of leadership courses at Trent. And so I thought, if I had the opportunity, how can we do this from an interdisciplinary lens? And my doctorate is in higher ed leadership, which I find fascinating. And I don't want to say I know nothing, but I have so much more to learn. I love this concept of leadership. It is so diverse and so complex. And it's almost, I talk about it in the same way that we describe love. Like there's no one definition. And we have our own understandings and we have so many different examples. And I really, in my experience, true leadership comes out when there is crisis of a variety. It's not when everything is hunky-dory. And I thought, how can we dissect this? And granted, I'm a straight, white, cisgendered woman, but I became a director before 30. And even the prejudices that I got of like, how can you be at this level? You're a woman. And from, let's say, older individuals, I just wanted to blow up this idea of what we see as a leader. I hated the notion and narrative that people had that they weren't leaders because they weren't loud, they weren't extroverted, they were an individual of color, whatever it may be. So I wanted to blow that all up, and I wanted to take a deeper look at, who leaders are, how do we lead during crisis? Because sometimes we don't get that opportunity to really understand unless we're in crisis. So, I wasn't going to put all the students in crisis. I thought, how could we at least learn from one another so that we can at least best prepare? And so I just wanted to talk about this a little bit more and got the opportunity to do so thanks to the support of some of the fantastic people in the School of Ed.
Yeah, and I'm interested in this word crisis. When you refer to crisis, are you referring to the general concept of crisis, conflict, an abstract concept, or are you really teaching to specific crises now in 2024 that we are living through or have recently lived through? Like, what is your definition? What's the scope of that concept within the course?
Well, I think that's still evolving for me, to be honest, if I'm being like fully vulnerable. I think I've done this course twice or facilitated this course twice. And the first year when we did it, I presented on it at a national conference, and I got a lot of questions about the difference between a crisis and an incident and people's understanding about, is a student suicide or a student death, is that a crisis or is that an incident? Or, for example, if there were multiple deaths, maybe it's a symptom of a larger crisis like mental health on campus. And so, to be honest, depending on who our facilitators were and our guest speakers, Lauren, we looked at every single type of crisis. We looked at things that were going on long term. So to backtrack a little bit, the request to me was to teach a class about COVID and leadership. And I said, no, we're sick and tired of talking about COVID. Can I do crisis instead? COVID can be an example, but with all due respect, people are still grieving. We're still in it. This is, some crisis can go on for a very long time. So I would say some of the examples are present day, but we're looking at something that really changes the environment. It may be overnight. It may be for months at a time. And so as a class, and it's differed, and I should look them up and I can pass it along, we come up with our own definition, our own working definition of what a crisis is to make sure we're all on the same page of what we are going to be talking about. So I would say it's a mishmash of all of it. But we are dealing with some present day things because that's where people speak to. But what we have seen is a real diverse understanding of what constitutes a crisis on individuals' own campuses, because most of them are practicing educators, and to our own knowledge of what a crisis is. So it's a work in progress, to say the least.
I am thinking back to a lecture I was in a couple years ago. It was about climate change education, and the speaker referred to the etymology of the word crisis, and I've just verified it here. But it links back to the Latin word, or it links back to Latin and Greek, and the root means discrimination, decision. And when the speaker was talking about it in the context of climate change, she referred to the climate crisis as an important decision point for humanity. Are we going to continue with the status quo, which essentially has gotten us into this mess? Or are we going to decide to make a change or many changes and do things a bit differently? So I often think about that in the context of some of the other events that I might consider crises or that are referred to crises in the media. In taking the course, though, what are you and your student, what outcomes are you and your students working towards specifically?
For sure. I mean, I have all the pretty outcomes that are on the syllabus that you can all read about, that are tied to the School of Education or the MEd's desired outcomes, and you have to match them to those. But my outcomes really were, in a more layman's terms, I wanted students to first look inwards and explore their own understanding of what it means to be a leader, and to understand what skill sets they have and how they can strengthen their own skills and competencies. So we spend the first few weeks not even talking really about crisis, but using different tools like a values assessment and a character strengths assessment to get a better understanding of who they are, so that they can see themselves and apply their own understanding of their leadership skills to the different crises. So one outcome is that they have a better understanding of their own skill set and what they need to work on and to strengthen. And so that was really interesting, and to see themselves as leaders, because even at the master's level, when I ask, I would say a third on average say that they connect with the term leader and see themselves as a leader, and I wanted to shift that for them. Secondly, I wanted the students to hear from other leaders in the field. So we had a guest speaker every single week who are dealing with crisis, from financial crisis to COVID to staff burnout. And I wanted there to be conversation, a deep conversation, vulnerable conversation. And to note, this class has only ever been done online. So I was adamant about doing this class online because I wanted everyone to have the same real estate space on the screen. And while I think it's great to bring in folks, sorry, I'm going to cough. Sorry, James. While I wanted to bring in folks, I don't think my experience has been I can create or help facilitate community in a better way if everybody has the same shared real estate space on a screen than folks far away at a table in a classroom and then the speakers on the screen. The connection piece is super important to me. And I wanted to build that. And so I wanted the opportunity for students to ask leaders, to ask authors of books that they had read, which we were able to do. And then lastly, I wanted to assign assignments where they could be creative, where they could apply their knowledge to real life situations. And I think we get into it a little bit, but I had them look at a crisis in a creative way. Not everybody's skill set shines in the written form. My writing is not the strongest, but I know other folks have real strengths in the way they articulate themselves verbally, creatively, and I wanted it to see and to feel real. And the class revolved around constant reflections in our learnings every single week, checking in with ourselves. So it was kind of threefold. I wanted them to get to know more about themselves. I wanted an outcome for them to feel more confident in their skills, to have an understanding of crisis by talking through folks. And I wanted them to be able to apply their learning in a real life way.
I think it's interesting what you said about insisting on the course being online so as to perhaps remove some of those hierarchical structures that are typical to so many in-person courses, and everybody gets the same real estate on the screen. I've never thought of it that way, and it's quite interesting. Everyone's square is the same size, and we all have equal access to the space and to each other and to the guest speaker. That's an interesting outcome to come from this online environment. Just out of curiosity, and I mean, we can cut this out if we want to, but I'm just curious because sometimes I do some online teaching as well. What is your policy around the cameras on, cameras off bit? Because I know there's controversy here and quite a wide range of opinions from students and faculty.
I'll have to look at the syllabus, Lauren. I wrote it in a way, I had people help me. I wrote it in a way that, like, it is your choice. and that to me, nonverbals and things like that are really important in the conversation. I didn't put it in that way, but that in my experience, the experience has been richer if folks are on screen, but you have to do whatever you do is best. And I would say I had 17 students on average, 16 of them always had their cameras on. And we also did a bunch of, I know icebreakers get a really bad rap, but I think they're really vital. And again, I have my master's degree literally in icebreakers, but I think group dynamic activities are very important if you know how to facilitate them. And so a struggle with online is to create that connection and that community and that vulnerability. And I did a lot of work in and around team builders and whatnot. And when I tell you, like, people shared things about their lives, they cried, they supported each other. It was so, so beautiful. And they did it on camera and online. It was magical. And so that's a hard thing to do online, but I was up for the challenge. So I am open if folks, and they would profusely, I don't know if it's because they're master students, profusely apologize to me if they had to go offline. But again, I think I said it once, the language is in my syllabus or in the syllabus, but I was very open to you do whatever you want. And I have found the experiences more engaging if you're able to be there visually.
I really like when you talk about values and the importance of discussing values with your students and prompting them to consider what their values are. And this is something I've tried to talk about with my teacher candidates as well. And I've used some variation of a values exercise with them. One of my top values is community. And so I loved that you brought up community and how you really focus on that with your own students by working to create that sense of community among your group. But can you talk a little bit more about how knowing one's values, or maybe use a couple of examples, might translate into a positive example of effective leadership? So what I mean by that is I think a lot about education, right? And so if we think about education and I think about, okay, one of my top values is community. But then if you walk into my classroom and all of my desks are in rows and there is no collaboration happening, well, my value of community is not being reflected in the physical classroom environment. So when we talk about leadership, how might we think about how our values are translating into our effectiveness as a leader?
For sure. So the experience is really interesting because I do like the card sorting value exercise, which I'm more than happy to share, which I learned at the University of Connecticut. And we spend, almost 2 hours going through it, debriefing it. How did we feel? And we never actually talk about, you don't have to share with me what your value is. It's more about the process. Because a lot of times folks know they have values, but they can't name them and right off the bat. And I think it's important for all of us, because our values can change, to take stock every 6 months, every year, and understand what our values are, because I do think it connects to the way we lead, the way we show up, etc. A great example that one of the speakers spoke about, Hamza Khan, who writes the book Reinventing Leadership, which I tell everyone to read. But he came in and he talked a story about the CEO of Airbnb. And one of his values, he's always talked about community, the human experience, and harmony. Like, those are some of his values. So when COVID hit, obviously in that line of work, when people are not going on vacation and not renting homes, he had to lay people off. And there was a variety of ways we saw in the world in which people did this. And the way he did this is, it had to happen. Financially, it had to happen because they couldn't go on the way they were. But he personally talked to every single person they laid off. He said, I will write you a letter of reference. They had a fund for them to get reskilled. And it was that human piece. So he could have just sent an email like we saw with a lot of companies. So sorry. Thank you, Anne, for your service. It is done. But because he valued community and connection and harmony so much. He took the time and said, I'm showing up. And I know this is devastating news. And it's not to lessen the blow. The same outcome can occur, but the way we get there can be very different and leave a very different taste in one's mouth and on one's heart. And so he did a long list of things. But to me, off the top of my head, I think that's such a beautiful example of him like living his values. Did he have to do any of that? No. And he showed up for his people because he knew that this was going to be really, really hard. And so I just thought that was such a beautiful example when Hamza shared that with us. And we see that one a lot when it comes down to the human experience and how do we lead during a crisis. And sometimes we forget about the human experience. I don't know if that answers your question.
That's a beautiful example.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm still thinking a little bit about the crisis piece, just circling back to that a little bit. Sometimes I find it easiest to conceptualize a learning experience by thinking about the assessments and what our goals for learning are through those assessments. I guess this is, giving away that I'm in the School of Education and we just think about assessment a lot. But I noticed that on your syllabus, you have a response to crisis assignment. And I was wondering if you might be willing just to share some of the outline of that assignment. I'm curious.
For sure. So I wanted them to, instead of writing, and they had the opportunity later on to write a more theoretical, research-based paper, because I wanted to make sure that students had a piece of work that if, like I, decided that they wanted to do a doctorate later on, but didn't do a thesis, they had a piece of work that they could hand in an application, because I did not do a thesis in my master's and still got into a doctorate program. So I wanted to switch it up, and through some of the conversations I've had with you both and with other wonderful folks in the School of Ed and the Center of Teaching and Learning, I just wanted more opportunities for creativity and for application, that they could really think about things. And for some of them, I think it was potentially therapeutic. So I asked students to imagine that they were in a high-level leadership role, and some of them already were. Some of them were presidents of their union. Some of them were principals. I had a superintendent. Some of these folks were in high-level leadership positions, and a crisis occurs. And I asked them to respond to the crisis. They had to give me a summary. So for some of them, I said, you can pick something that you actually experienced, or you can write up something that you want to apply your learning to, or that you've seen but didn't live through. It could be whatever. And then I asked them to think about their own values and the way they want to lead. Maybe it's based on a theory, to write a little bit of a summary of what their approach is, so that I have an understanding of where they're coming from. And then I asked them to respond, and they could be as creative as they wish. So they could do a response via email. So maybe it's an email going out to parents and community stakeholders about an incident. It could be a memo. It could be a letter. I had one student do a social media campaign. So pretending that she was going on the social media channel of the school due to an incident. I've had students do a response on the news and pretend they're being interviewed by a newscaster, and how they wanted to convey their leadership during a crisis. And so they could be as creative as they want, because again, not everybody is strong at writing a paper and can express the way they want to lead. And so it was really fascinating to see. I had way more creativity the second time around than the first time around. A lot of folks just did a memo, but I had one student do a meeting with their, like a staff meeting, and then she created an agenda, speaking notes, etc. I had another one do a social media campaign, a third do a video that was on the news. Like, it was really interesting. And I just wanted them to, as humanly possible, put their identity and their values like in another person's shoes, and think about it if they really were there. And for some people, like I said, I think it was therapeutic, because they said, I went through this crisis. And usually we say, I think the leaders didn't do what I would have done. And then they get to think about, actually, what would they have done? And sometimes they have greater empathy for the decisions that were made. And other times they got to explore how they might how they may have approached the situation. So that was kind of my inspiration, is to make it as real life as possible without creating an actual crisis for them to lead through.
That's awesome.
I bet students were quite engaged in that assignment.
I think it's fun. I mean, my goal is to create assignments selfishly too that I would want to do myself. Like if I'm dreading an assignment and or grading it, then there's going to be students that think the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, and I can see right off the bat how this assignment holds so much value. And I think it also it holds value for a variety of folks working in different professions. So it's not just for teachers, it's not just for administrators or people working in higher ed. I think that this course could benefit a number of individuals, which is a segue into my next question. I'm just curious to know, are the people who enroll in your course, are they coming from a variety of different professional backgrounds, or are they working in one sector? What do you tend to notice?
Well, I've taught 3 courses in the field or in this department, and two has been this iteration of this crisis and leadership class. And they're all in leadership, or they're all in, well, yes, all in leadership, but all in education in some way, shape, or form. But the beautiful part was there was probably, I would say, a 30 to 35 year age difference between some of my students. So we have students that just entered their master's, just graduated. They are 22. They have a different life experience than someone that is in their 50s. Retirement is around the corner. And so while they're all in education, some of them are in K-12, others are in post-secondary. We have a handful always of folks that work at the institution, which is an interesting piece here at Trent because they're my colleagues and now also students in my class. So they're all educators in some way, shape, or form. But anything from a private school to, again, working for a district or a board, working at a post-secondary institution, there's quite an interesting diversity there. Low-income schools, again, private schools that are financially very well off. So I think it's really interesting because while we're still in one quote-unquote field, I would say there was quite a lot of diversity in who the students were, their age, where they were in their field, and where they were in their master's program too.
Well, I can't help but think about how effective this course might be in other subject areas or other programs. So if we were to go there, what are some of the main features of your course or approaches that you use in your course that might support the development of other courses like it in other programs or other institutions?
So when you asked this question, because I prepared for things, I thought I can tell you all day what I think the standout features are, but I asked my students. So 5 of them work at the institution. So I shot them a Teams message and I said, from your perspective, what do you think the standout features were? So if that's okay, I will tell you what they said, because I could have been totally wrong. You know, you put out what you think. So a lot of them talked about engaging with the guest speakers who shared their firsthand experience. I think that was really valuable for them because they saw these leaders as humans. These leaders were vulnerable. These leaders, I think, also really appreciated the opportunity. And just to share, we hardly ever talked about specific crisis. We talked about themes within it. But to talk about a crisis every single week is very, very heavy. And so I was very conscious of that. So we talked things around staff morale. We talked about longevity. We talked about how to handle certain aspects, how to communicate within a crisis. We had an education minister come in from the Yukon territories, etc. Why I say this is because we did have one where we did a hit and run on campus, and not our campus, but a campus. And we had the 2 folks that navigated that whole scene. So we had arrest warrants, affidavits, the whole slot. And for them, they come to my class because they do it to keep the woman's memory alive, the woman that had passed. So I think it's also to see that type of vulnerability and to see the impact that coming as a speaker can also have. The students talked about the opportunity to stretch their own leadership skills for example, in that assignment, and we had tons of group discussion. I always worry that 3 hours is way too much time. It's never enough time. They could talk all day. Another student said it was really great to discover their own strengths. Another one said a standout feature was to understand yourself as a leader and to recognize through this course that leadership does not have to stand still, that it is a fluid process, and what may have worked at one time may not work again. And another one really appreciated the listening. So the listening to stories and understanding how they all link to leadership, and said such an important piece of communication, and that communication needs to be a dialogue and not a monologue. So I think this is what they thought was some of the standout features. And I appreciate that, because that was my goal, for there to be connection and community and learning from discussion, because I just didn't think 36 hours of me talking was really going to be the most valuable experience.
Yeah, thank you so much for going to your students. That was very thoughtful of you. And I love hearing the unique perspectives, but they also align in certain ways. And it sounds like the experiences have been really positive for yourself and for your students. And so then, just in summary, for those who have not had the benefit of taking this lovely class or one like it, it is a difficult question, but are you able to offer any general or specific advice to either K-12 educators or higher ed administrators or academics who really just wish to better support their students during various crises? Can you offer any just, bullet point specific or general bits for them to think about?
For sure. And I think it applies to both K-12 and higher ed. Granted, I've never worked in K-12, but I've been a camp counselor for a very long time for that age group. And while I have a 2.5-year-old, I know those conversations are a little bit detailed, but I have a somewhat understanding. And so there's a few things that I thought about. I thought, if it's at all possible, if folks would like more experience but can't take the class, I know that this course has become a catalyst for some schools, and this is predominantly K-12 schools, from some of the comments I've gotten from the students that were in the class, to engage in role-playing or case studies through different crises so that they can talk through process and procedures. So in their staff meetings, to understand if they don't have a process or a procedure or an SOP, a standard operation practice, whatever that acronym is. So a lot of them have said we've brought some of these crisis to our classrooms and into our other teachers and talked through them as a professional development opportunity. But what would happen if X, Y, Z happened? I think the other piece is to really understand then how they can create a safe and brave community and safe community for folks, because no matter during a crisis, based on our own experiences and our own life, we're going to experience that crisis differently. And so if you are a leader, it's situational leadership. What works for Anne might not work for Lauren, but how do we make sure that it's a safe and brave space? I think the other piece is to be vulnerable. We're not all experts on a crisis, but if we know how to ask for help, there are people that are. And I think sometimes our understanding of leadership, or some people's operational definition of leadership, is like the content expert, that they know what to do and how to do it. And I don't know half the things that in my office. I don't know how to do an academic advising appointment or academic skills, but I know how to support a safe and brave environment and take obstacles out of their way, etc. And so I think it's being able to, if you're a leader, to ask for help, to be human. Nobody's asking you to be a robot, but also to not freak out and get the support. You're facilitating a situation. And so understanding what your own resources are. I think, what else did I write down? I think it's okay to say that you don't know and to seek out those supports. Again, all the leaders that we spoke to talked about the importance that other people had when they helped navigate a crisis. I remember when I went through my first student death, I was like, I don't know what to do. And there are the policies and the procedures but I called on people and they said, be human, take care of your people. And so it was as simple as making sure people ate. And so I think it's being human. But if folks, especially the K-12 educators, if they're looking to strengthen any skill set or to be prepared for crisis, if it helps them because they need it, do case studies. There's more than enough case studies in the news to talk through it and say, what would happen if there was a fire? What would happen if there was a student death in our school physically, not just at home? Like, let's talk through this. What would we do? What would be our plan? Because it'll make some folks feel just a little bit more prepared for something that you actually can't fully prepare for. But those are the few tidbits that I would say. But again, I think I would have to think a lot more about it. I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry.
It does. Thank you, Steph. Thank you for all that you do.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you wanted to say today? You've given us a lot to think about.
I think it's amazing that the two of you are doing this. And I would say that if anybody is interested in this course, I told the students this. I said, this is like a tasting menu. You are not going to leave the class being like, I have all the tools in my toolbox. I can lead any crisis. I am going to be the superintendent and the principal. You are literally going to taste test everything, and we are barely going to scrape the surface. And that's okay, because this could be an entire doctorate degree. And I know there's probably doctorate degrees on how to handle crisis management. I just am so appreciative that I work at an institution and in a department that is so open to new ideas and new things. And I'm very appreciative of both of your support and the work that you're doing through this podcast. And I think at the end of the day, I still have a ton to learn about this field, and I will always be learning. And my role is not to teach, it's just to facilitate the learning experience, because we're all the knowledge creators in that space. And so I just feel super privileged that I've gotten that opportunity. So thank you.
Well, now you have me thinking about a Part B course, like a Part 2 of your course. And so maybe that's something you might throw together for us, and then we could do a Part B of our podcast with you.
There you go. I'm always open to it.
Thanks, Steph.
All right. Thank you again. We would like to acknowledge that this episode was recorded on Michissagig, Mississauga territory, treaty and traditional, at Trent University in Peterborough, Nogojoanong, Ontario, Canada. We are grateful to the First Nations of this territory for their teachings about and care for the land on which we teach and learn. The podcast was made possible by a Trent University Knowledge Mobilization Grant and is skillfully edited and produced by our friend, James Bailey.